Well, hello, Clenton.
Hello, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. And how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
We've just been having a lovely conversation with Bryony Shannon today, who works for Doncaster Council but writes a blog on language in social care. And what a fascinating chat that was, really. It's a really important topic, the power of language and how it affects the way we think and behave in this world.
She mentioned about stories, you know, the structures and the solutions, but we need to tell people what social care is for. She mentions about social care futures. She mentions making it real. But the core element for me, it's about belonging. Yeah. And the thing that's just popped into my head from the conversation is about fixing the environment, but not fixing people.
Mm.
So, you know, that's what she left me pondering about how, you know, we can move the culture and the behaviour to, you know, fixing the environment, but not fixing people.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I think framing the right language, or more positive, progressive language, goes a long way to fix that environment, doesn't it? I think.
Yeah.
And she made that point about how the power sits within our own hands sometimes to make these small changes that, when kind of multiplied up, have a massive, massive impact on the culture and the way things are done, really. Welcome, Bryony, to Changing It Up. It's lovely to have you.
Hi, both of you. Hi, Nick. Hi, Clenton. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. I'm really honoured.
It's our pleasure. We should be the ones honoured with all the blogs that you write and about language. So thank you.
Which indeed is what we're hoping to find out a lot more about through our conversation today. But as first, Bryony, as you know, as an avid listener to Changing It Up, we always start our podcast interviews with a number of quickfire questions in order to get to know our guests a little better. So I'm going to go with the first question, which is, if you could only eat one dish or meal for the rest of your life, Bryony, what would it be?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I'm quite a foodie and I love cooking and baking and things. So that is a really hard one for me. I think I'm going to go with, it's quite a broad thing. Can I go with veggie breakfast that I can then adapt and bring in different foods into that? So I always need to have something green on my plate as well. I'm a real kind of a bit of a lapsed veggie, but I don't eat red meat, but I do really need to have green things. So I like kind of like brunchy type breakfasts, but I tend to kind of add a bit of greenery into them.
An adaptable breakfast that you could add in any number of vegetables into over the course of time. Well, I suppose, I think it's, it's, you know, we'll accept that, Clenton, will we?
That's quite radical. Yeah, I like that. Bryony, my question. And if you could only go to one more place on holiday for the rest of your life, where would that be?
I do really like holidays on the East Coast, so like Scarborough and Bridlington. But I think the last couple of holidays, in the time that we've been allowed to have holidays, we've been to Devon and we've had some really lovely family holidays just around kind of Totnes, Stoke Fleming, Dartmouth area. Just lovely. I love the sea, the light, all of it. So I think Devon would be my place.
Very nice. How do you like to pass time, Bryony? Do you have any hobbies or particular interests that you pursue?
Cooking, baking, reading, enjoy swimming, and particularly when we were in Devon, did a lot of swimming in the sea, avoiding jellyfish, of which there were quite a lot actually. But spending time in my garden. I think last year, particularly in lockdown, when it was that amazing spring, it was sort of really reassuring to be in the garden and see nature, and kind of see things carrying on and thriving when there was so much uncertainty. So go for walks and drinks and coffees with friends. I think that, again, with sort of lockdown and not being able to go into lots of people's houses and different places, just spending time outside has been great. And writing, I guess, writing my blog as well is something that does I don't know. I don't really get enough time for it, really. I would like to spend a bit more time doing that. But yeah, writing's it's really brought a lot to me, I think, just having that sort of reflective space and time, and it's just an amazing process, and it's kind of connected me with lots of brilliant, fabulous, inspiring people, including yourselves.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
A bit of flattery. Right, stop asking me such hard questions.
I'll get you everywhere on changing it up, certainly. Thank you.
Bryony, my question, what was the last TV show you watched that you really enjoyed?
Well, this time of the year, it has to be Strictly and Bake Off are my kind of autumnal favourites. My go-to, like dark evenings, a bit of the kind of the glitz and the glamour of Strictly and all the costumes and all the dancing. It's just, that's my Saturday night sorted. And then Bake Off as well. It's just like a long-standing pleasure.
And the more highbrow question for me now, what was the last book you read?
The last novel I read was The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, which was brilliant. Really, really enjoyed that. And then at the moment, I'm reading a book called The Trampoline Effect. I don't know whether you've heard of that. It's basically about George Tulloch and Sarah Schulman, I think. I've got it here in front of me. About kind of rehumanizing our social system, so very relevant, and loads of good insight in there. And I'm also kind of flicking into, I've just treated myself to Nigel Slater's new recipe book, which I'm also reading because I love his writing as well as his recipes. So normally have a few books on the go.
That's really nice, thank you for that. But my question is the most important question of all of the questions that I'm asking. You've got £1 million to spend in 12 months, what would you do?
Okay, so I don't know. If I was going to be totally selfish and just spend it on myself, I would probably buy a house with a bigger garden and a swimming pool. But I do like my house. I don't really want to move. So I think, I don't know. I really like the idea of sort of crafting creative stuff. And have you seen those human libraries where you get sort of borrow a person rather than a book and find out about their experience, and it's a lot about breaking down kind of labels and things. I think I'd like that kind of concept, but more about sharing skills and really kind of around creativity, sort of arts, crafts, baking, gardening. So maybe some sort of like crafty centre library type thing where you could borrow people with different skills and share skills, and also maybe have a cafe in a garden so you could kind of test out some of the baking that you're learning and growing. And it's something really creative, I think would be quite nice, and think about connecting people up. Not anything that would have those hideous labels like activities or befriending or something like that, not a service, but just something that's very much about connecting people up, and that sort of creativity, I suppose, and curiosity and compassion. All those things that are kind of missing from a lot of our social care world.
Interesting. I really like that. So my question now, this is the serious part, I think. But I've been very interested in the work that you do, especially your blogs. Why does language matter, and how does it affect the way we think and behave?
Okay, it's a great question. And I think that kind of why does language matter, that was the first kind of the topic of my first blog, really. So I think it matters precisely from that second part of your question, really, that it does affect the way that we think and we behave. So it's fundamental in that. The word vulnerable is one of my kind of pet hate words, and that is a really good example of how it does affect our thinking and our behaviour. So the way it's been used during the pandemic, it's not the term itself that's the problem. I mean, that sort of vulnerability, we're all human, we're all vulnerable. That's not really the issue, but it's the way it's used as a label for people. So that when we talk about vulnerable people or those who are vulnerable, we're kind of immediately creating that sort of sense. We immediately think about other people and that sort of difference and them and us, sort of grouping people, separating people off. And I think people start to lose that kind of sense of individual identity because they're being kind of just grouped into that, especially that when that term sort of evolves into the vulnerable, which has been used quite a lot in the during the pandemic in the press and things. and we start kind of ranking people as well, and that kind of most vulnerable or too vulnerable or not vulnerable enough. And I think that then leads to things that sort of testing out that vulnerability. So we introduce things like assessments and screening and eligibility determinations, so people have to prove how vulnerable they are, and all those power dynamics start to come into play. And I think that the same, so that when we talk about our most vulnerable, that the hour in that kind of ownership and control of people, that sort of possessive paternalistic response really, and that what we've seen a lot during COVID is that kind of language around protecting our most vulnerable, that sort of caring for and doing to people, fixing people. So that kind of any thought of a person having any choice or control or agency or even rights is kind of has disappeared. In fact, sort of any thought of a person at all has disappeared in all of this kind of language. And I think with COVID, that narrative of heroes as well, and that sort of distinction between heroes looking after our most vulnerable wasn't good. And I think it gets sort of more sinister as well in terms of those messages in lockdown, like sort of like messages in the press and on Twitter and things about like quarantine the vulnerable, let the rest of us get on with our lives. And there's a newspaper headline called that said Christmas sacrifice to protect the vulnerable. And I think it is that sort of real that growing division and that blaming people, and also just that whole thing around kind of the sort of people in power talking the language they were using. So the then Health and Social Care Minister Matt Hancock talking about people in social care being uniquely vulnerable, and I think Chris Whitty said that we'd see a higher mortality rate in care homes because this is a very vulnerable group. So that language that suggests that an inevitability to deaths, and it kind of distracts us from what is making people vulnerable, and those sort of situations and circumstances and all the policies and prejudice and power dynamics and the politics around that. So particularly around COVID, with all those kind of decisions about do not attempt resuscitation and herd immunity and the kind of discharge from hospitals to care homes, and so a whole load of decisions that were made that actually made people more vulnerable. So I think that it really demonstrates the kind of the power of language in that and the kind of the implications of it. I think in terms of just paying attention, I think it's really important that we pay attention to the language that we use and that we have time to reflect on it as well. So I think a lot of the words that we use in the system that we work in, it's the system, it's those words about kind of signposting and screening and triaging and pathways and processes and placements. They're all those kind of languages of transactions and sort of moving people through a system. That's that kind of social care sorting office that we've talked about, that it's just about processes. There's no sense of any connections or relationships in there. It's just about those kind of transactions and moving people on, moving people through a system. And also the kind of the blame side of things as well. I talked about it a bit with vulnerable, but that labels we use like challenging and complex and hard to reach, refuses to engage, difficult. I think they're all blaming individual people, and they're all kind of deflecting attention away from our role in that and the kind of our own attitudes and behaviours and how that kind of causes other people's behaviours and the impact it has on other people's behaviours. So I think it sort of language shuts down a lot of things as well and sort of doesn't make room for those conversations. So it's really important that we have them. I think I don't know, I could tell just think one of the other words is around care and the way that we sort of use care. So we don't really talk about caring about people or caring about each other. It's very much caring for people, and it's kind of care has become that word that we sort of associate with plans and with packages and service delivery. So kind of home care and day care, residential care. And it's that sort of idea of care as a destination. So people go into care and we place people in care. So it's not something that we feel. It's not about caring about people. It's sort of doing to people and fixing people. So often we've sort of lost the social side of it as well. So there's a lot to talk about care, a lot less talk about social care. And for me, it's the social bit that's the kind of the critical fundamental bit, that bit about relationships and friendships and love and belonging. And those are the bits that for me are at the core. But those are the bits that we seem to have lost in that kind of endless focus on just kind of personal care and kind of people surviving rather than actually kind of aspirations and goals and thriving. So yeah, I think it's key. I think it really matters, and I think that's a language and kind of practice change really go hand in hand, that we can't really can't change what we do without changing our language.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Really fascinating insights there into all of that, and I think that's really helpful the way you've articulated that. And I think that kind of leads on to my next question, really, about this is so ingrained, isn't it, this language in this sort of wider health, social care, housing sort of support, well-being sort of infrastructure that we have in this country. And I think it must be tough for people who are coming to this realization, who are part of that system, to be able to stand up to it, really, to be able to say, actually, no, I think we need to frame this in a different way. And that maybe is one of the reasons why things don't change as quickly as we would like them to do. But for those who are thinking that, who are listening to you right now and thinking, yeah, Bryony's, what she's saying is really resonating with me. What do you think are the practical things that people who are working in this world and who engage with this can do to use more positive language in this sort of health and social care environment? How could people actually move away from that and towards this new language, this new narrative that you outline? What are the practical things?
Yeah, I think that's just picking up on that kind of idea of people coming in and thinking that there's that thing about thinking they have to use a certain language to be heard or to get in. So that kind of, they have to have those labels. So kind of complex needs or at risk or vulnerable, you kind of have to have those labels, which makes me really uncomfortable. But I think there's some really basic kind of practical things that we can all do. I think I saw something on Twitter. I'm on Twitter far too much, so I don't read enough books probably, but there's something on Twitter in the week thing, which was, I think it was Alex Fox quoting Math Potts from the Caring Places gathering this week, which sadly I couldn't get to. But it was he was saying, talk like people talk, not how services talk. So I think that's just a real key, just be more human in how we talk. So stop using the jargon and acronyms and labels. If you do anything else, stop using labels, and don't use jargon and acronyms, because they're just so damaging, I think, and excluding. A couple of other good, like, quick, easy things. If you talk about people, talk about people. So don't call people service users and customers and clients and referrals. And a couple of words that I really, really dislike, sort of in that vein, are case. So the way we talk about people as cases. So I'm working with a case, or I've just picked up a case, and those as well. So I really picked up on that kind of during COVID, that those with underlying health conditions, or those in care homes, or those who are vulnerable, it's really that sort of those dehumanizing terms that really do kind of group and other people and add that layer of distance and detachment. So I think definitely people, and if you're talking about where people live, homes, don't use the word home, don't use words like settings and schemes and units and placements and services and facilities, because I think if it doesn't feel appropriate to call the place that someone's in a home, then it probably doesn't feel like home to them either. And that's that fundamental thing of the social care future vision, if that living in a place we call home is that's what we want, that's what we should want for each other. Talk about home and talk about people, and just talk about language. I think have those conversations with colleagues, with people, ideally with people who draw on social care, to get their perspective in these conversations, because so often we don't. And I know, for example, Leicester have done some really good work recently, I think, looking at their language around reviews and the kind of the way that they structure their kind of review forms to capture those conversations, but also the letters that they send out when they're looking at reviews. So just that, just involving people, as with everything. The more people with experience of drawing on care and support that you can involve, the better you're going to get at this, really, because you're getting it get called out, which is fine. So we should be. So we've really experienced that in Doncaster. We're doing some work around looking at our people improving people's experience of their kind of first contact with adults, social care in Doncaster. So as part of this, we've had lots of conversations with people with experience of seeking and drawing on support in Doncaster about what we want to do and how we want to change, but particularly around the term itself, the term front door, and what that symbolises in terms of access, because it's front doors used a lot, that kind of front door to services. But it was really picked out, which I was really pleased that we had this conversation early on. We did talk about kind of how it symbolises kind of those closed doors and entry criteria, and that we'd have those kind of thresholds and we're excluding people, that managing demand, signposting people away. And that's something that we really want to move away from. So it really helps kind of expose those sorts of things that we want to change and we want to shift away from, that kind of single access point, gateway to services type idea that we really want to kind of, it really helped shape our conversations about where we go next, and that we want to look to develop a much more sort of local, personalised approach that was really focusing on connecting people, and that really local peer support in that. So really getting away from that kind of one size fits all, everybody comes through this door if we let you, to a much more kind of open, accessible approach that's much more about kind of building those connections and relationships. And I think one of the other things I'm doing in Doncaster is we're looking at developing our sort of wider practice framework, and we're starting with that in terms of looking at kind of why we're here, because I think so often we don't. And I think because so much has changed kind of nationally and locally recently, especially with COVID, it's changed everything. I think we need to kind of reevaluate everything really. So we've adopted the social care future vision as our Doncaster vision. That's kind of our North Star really, our guiding light in terms of changing and developing our practice. So if anyone's not familiar with social care future, which hopefully everybody listening is familiar with social care future because it is the future, obviously. But that vision, well, the way that we've adopted the vision is we're saying we want Doncaster people to live in the place they call home, with the people and things that they love, in communities where they look out for one another, doing things that matter to them. So it's really sort of helping to shift that focus from that kind of traditional transactional assessments for services type of approach to really supporting people to live the lives they choose to lead, and that real focus on kind of purpose, meaning, connection. And we're really looking at how we remove the barriers to that. So it's not really about, it's not changing people, it's about changing that sort of wider system to make space for those conversations. And we're also looking at we signed up to the Making It Real framework, and we're also kind of embedding the Be Human movement principles into what we're doing. So, which I love, I really love those principles. So that kind of real focus, I think that's the sort of heart of them, is that treating people as people, not as kind of widgets and cogs in a system, which I think our language at the moment is kind of does treat people as widgets and cogs, that sort of real, that kind of transactional approach. So just things like being kind and trusting people and being more transparent. And I think our language really fits with that sort of just being more kind and more considerate and more respectful in the language that we use, and paying attention to it.
I'm really interested in what you said about, some of the transactional language, about screening, assessment, signposting, triage, and pathways. So how does this marry up with, we're using in the profession strength-based practice? It's at odds. If I was being totally honest, it feels a bit at odds at how, when you've just described the backdrop of what the reality is, but we're using new language and words like strength-based practice. How does that fit?
Yeah, great question. It's something I so need to write a blog about this, and I just haven't had a chance, but it's kind of in the back of my mind all the time, because I do have a real problem with the term strength-based practice, because I think it's been adopted as we've just been built into what we do, and it takes so much more. I mean, it's so much bigger than how it's interpreted. I think if we're really going to work with people, it is about seeing people as human beings and being human in how we work with people. And I don't think I think often it's kind of gets condensed down into the conversation, or it's not even about the conversation we have. Quite often I think it's just in terms of the support we plan, and it's about that kind of looking at what people can do for themselves and what people are connecting people within their communities first before we consider any kind of formal service, which is fine, but I don't think that's the be all and end all of the way that we should be practicing. And I think there's so much more about that I think, yes, we definitely need to consider people's strengths, but to do that, we have to think about the language we use in how we do that. And so much of our language is so deficit based, and our kind of systems rely on labels and rely on putting people in, like, sort of putting labels on people, that our systems are built around that, really. So you have to have the right label to go down the right pathway to get the right service. We just kind of rely on putting people into boxes like that. So I think in order to kind of really shift our practice, we have to look much broader than kind of the way that strength-based practice is interpreted at the moment. So I think we have to kind of look at how we're making decisions, and that the decisions are made with the person, by the person, by the people important to them, that they're at the heart of the decisions, when so often they're not at the moment. The decisions are made elsewhere about someone's life, but it's not the person making the decision. Somebody else kind of at a higher kind of management levels making decisions. I think it is the way we operate, kind of our sort of the number of handoffs we have in our systems, those kind of the processes and referrals. So we don't have space to create those relationships, develop those relationships with people and maintain those relationships, because it's very kind of moving on all the time. There's a lot of pressure to kind of keep moving things on. I don't think it's down to kind of individual workers who want to work differently. It's that kind of this whole system that we've built that is so focused on kind of outputs. We measure those kind of things in terms of just number, like waiting times and number of assessments completed and things, but we're not measuring the quality, and we're not listening to people in terms of what it looks like for them. So I think I don't know. I need to kind of spend more time thinking about the kind of the term strength-based as well. I'm not kind of dismissing strength-based working at all, but I just think it's one of those words that's a bit overused, and like co-production and like personalization, really, they're sort of thrown out. They're used ubiquitously without the practice change behind them and without the kind of value change. So I think they're seen as, you can go on like a half-day training course on strength-based practice. It's like, but it's not. It's like a fundamental shift in the whole way that we work, and I think that's that I have a problem with that kind of thinking. So I would never say that we change the language and that changes everything. It doesn't at all. There's a lot we can do by changing the language, but there's a lot of other change that has to happen on the back of that as well. And changing the language is never going to be enough. It can make a big difference. So things like talking about people rather than service users or cases, and things like just dropping those labels and dropping that jargon will make a huge difference. But there's an awful lot of other things that need to change in our wider practice to make how we work a lot more human, and to make us feel more human as well. I think it's not just about kind of seeing people we support as human, but it's about people working in kind of those human services sector feeling more human as well in their jobs. They're not feeling like they're kind of just processing people through a system, and they've sort of lost their identity as workers in that system as well. They've just become that. I wrote a blog fairly recently about kind of that sort of robotic robots that was based on the language of job descriptions, and how it's just become very much about processing cases through and assessing service users. That's the job, and that's not the job, and it's not the job that anybody wants to do, and it's not the job that people on the kind of the other side of that want to. They're not the workers that people want to be working with, because there's no kind of life in that, is there? It's just so kind of bland, I suppose.
Well, thank you, Bryony, so much for sharing your reflections with us today. That's been absolutely fascinating and really insightful and really inspiring to hear that. And I think those listening to this will take a lot from that. And thank you as well for the blog that you write and for continuing that to raise this as an issue, because I think it's something we continually need to be kind of reflecting on and thinking about in every aspect of our lives, regardless of what we do and where we work. So thank you very much for that contribution that you make.
I'd just like to say thank you for being an ally, for, you know, as a person who draws on care and support to try and create and move us towards that North Star that Social Care Future talks about, and the practical element of making it real, and the I statements and the we statements. So, you know, I just hope the social work profession becomes more of an ally with the movement and trying to get to that North Star. So more power to your fingers for typing those blogs. Really appreciate what you do.
Oh, thank you so much. Now, it's been really lovely to talk to you both. Really enjoyed it. So yeah, thank you.